Now everyone can see your beautiful face. Okay, there we go.
And maybe more.
And maybe more. Oh, well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I very much appreciate it. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people out there who don't know a ton about like nuclear energy, nuclear power. And you seemed extremely knowledgeable when I met you in the open panel the other day on Prime Kai's
Yeah.
stream. So I figured I'd
Thanks.
have you on to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Karl. I am not in the field of nuclear energy directly, but my family works in energy. My wife's entire family works in fossil fuels, and my dad worked as project manager for Satsup's nuclear power plant when that was being constructed. And I've learned a lot, not only growing up outside of Oak Ridge, but a huge amount when I got really energized in, doing something about the climate after about 2014, 2015, when I saw we weren't really headed in the right direction. And so I got plugged into the Seattle nuclear energy community because we have some really fantastic startups in Seattle looking to solve any of the problems or any of the perceived problems uh, in the area. So of the area of reactors, I guess I should say. So yeah, I've been pretty obsessed. I will speak with anyone on Twitch at the drop of the hat about nuclear energy. I do all sorts of local activism, as you can see, posters I got set up for the cameras, and I'm a one of the organizers with Seattle Friends of Fission, and I get plugged into all sorts of nationwide nuclear activism here and there, including I was able to speak at Thorium Energy Alliance conference last year. That was great.
That's
So,
amazing. So, um, what was I guess what was the catalyst for you to like get interested in all of this? Like back in 2014, you said. Like you
well,
noticed we weren't going the right
yeah.
direction, but what does that mean?
Well, had started a family. My daughter was born about 6 years ago, and yeah, and it was like, well, what have I've done wonderful, fun things on this planet with my career, but what's going to be there for my family after me, and what are we actually going to solve the great problems that we've tried and tried again to address? And really, then I started looking into things like thorium, got super excited, but then I met some actual nuclear engineers in the region and sort of got back to a solid middle ground in terms of my technology enthusiasm.
Okay. So for I don't know a whole lot about nuclear power, so this is why I'm very excited. I think
Cool.
my basic position the other day when we started talking about nuclear power, I think would largely be representative of like the maybe a lot of people who don't have a whole lot of knowledge about what nuclear is aside from like what we've learned via osmosis from like TV and movies and news about natural disasters and stuff like that. So there
Right.
there's like a whole lot of I think misconceptions, at least that, as far as what I understand now. There's a whole lot of misconceptions about safety, about disposal, about whether this is like something that's viable for the future. So can you give us like a rundown on like maybe like a primer on your basic position so we can kind of like understand where you're coming from?
Right. Well, I guess the 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 elevator pitch is radiation is everywhere. We use radiation, especially in the medical field, to treat something wrong with a patient, and so that's called a medical intervention. For any medical intervention, the risk, the damage to the patient must be less than that which they're trying to cure, or than the risk to them if that disease is left untreated. And just like an X-ray, I think we need nuclear energy as part of the climate solution. Despite any risks that may exist, we are facing a couple hundred years left before it's too late for us to change the climate back to what it started at when we evolved.
Yeah, and I definitely like I hear all of that, and I think that that's a really good argument, to be honest. Like, I feel like at this point we should be throwing anything and everything and into this problem and trying to figure it out from, maybe not just nuclear, but like also other renewables where it works and where it doesn't work. We do have nuclear as a viable option,
Mm-hmm.
and also on top of that, like it's from what I gleaned from you the other day, like there are all kinds of innovations that have been done in the field of like nuclear technology that are
Mm-hmm.
making these reactors much more efficient, much more safe. And there's a lot of other exciting things on the horizon. Like on stream the other day, we were going over, I think it's called the XE100, like isotropic or triso fueled reactors. I
Oh,
brought that up to you, I think.
yeah, yeah. So there's actually a company in Ballard here in Seattle called Ultrasafe Nuclear Company, and I've got an acquaintance, Chris Morrison, Dr. Chris Morrison. You can watch his video on my channel, uh, and so he's been working on the sort of the reactor design for a triso fueled uh, nuclear reactor for like the northern reaches of Canada, where right now they're shipping truckloads of oil every week to keep their operations running. And there's got to be a better solution than moving fossil fuels around.
Yeah, it seems doubly counterproductive for what we're trying to stop, right?
Right.
Um, and for those of you who don't know, I got really excited about this. I fell down the rabbit hole the other day, and trisofuel has been around for a while, but essentially it's like uranium coated with graphite and like a ceramic shell. And so you have these little micro beads inside of these either metal spheres or metal capsules
Mm-hmm.
that have protective layering over them, and then you put enough
Yeah.
of them in like a tube essentially, and they form a nuclear reaction. But
Right.
if you get into a really dangerous situation, you can just open the tube, they all fall out, and they're relatively harmless, like by
Yeah.
themselves.
That that's basically the formula behind any nuclear reactor.
Okay.
When you think of a gasoline engine, you need the right mix of air and fuel in order for combustion to happen. So if gas spills, it's not going to instantly explode,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
uh, Nuclear fuel is the same way. So if you literally take the uranium in today's nuclear plants and you just drop it straight down, it will be less reactive than when it was in the water moderator. There's other problems with the current fuel that we have, which is it's got this substance, this cladding, the armor around the outside
Hmm.
actually combusts if it gets too hot. It reacts
That seems like a
with yeah, with
not
water
good thing.
and and creates a buildup of hydrogen, which in the case of Fukushima Daiichi, that's what caused the explosions. So
Okay.
literally, the triso fuel you're talking about, it's got like this silicon carbide armor around every pellet, and they vary in size. Like some designs are like a golf ball or a baseball, and I think the ultra safe ones are tiny little beads. Uh, and but the idea is that if that reactor gets too hot, then the triso fuel and the salt will spread apart ever so slightly, and that will cause the fuel mixture, right, air and gasoline,
Hmm.
the fuel mixture called criticality to drop.
Okay. So, can you give us like a rundown basically on how nuclear reactors work? Kind of
Oh, right.
demystifying this concept for us, so that then we can get into like other, more maybe more technical things.
So you take a spicy rock
Mm-hmm.
and you mix it with water,
Right.
and you kind of bounce the spiciness, and it splits the atoms. No, sort of. But that's basically one of the funny ways, as I hear it. It is a spicy rock. It's called uranium 235. So that's I think it's like 92 protons and the rest neutrons. And this giant atom is so big that it's kind of slightly unstable. And if you hit it, or if you even bring another neutron close enough to it, it gets sucked in, and then it's too big and it rips itself in two.
Okay.
And when it comes out, remember we started with a 236 protons and neutrons. That is what you get out of the two halves. You still get 236. It actually had a very tiny loss in mass. Less than one subatomic particle was lost in that fissioning, and that creates an enormous amount of energy. So that those neutrons bouncing around have to be going the right speed, and they have to be the right temperature, or the uranium's not going to suck them in,
Mm-hmm.
or it's going to be very, very unlikely. We basically find this peak of likelihood of absorbing that neutron, and we get everything lined up so that if there's an accident, if there's a problem in the system, we change and the smallest variable, and it becomes less reactive.
Okay.
That Yeah, that's sort of the lesson of reactor safety after the 80s, after Chernobyl, where they had that defect of it was sort of like sitting in the middle or sitting in a point where it could suddenly escalate, and that's called a positive void coefficient, where the hotter that reactor got, the more bubbles in the water, the faster it would react.
Okay. So yeah, so now we have like a basic idea of like how reactors work.
Mm-hmm.
So like you mentioned Chernobyl and you mentioned the Fukushima Daiichi plant, which
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah,
are probably what most people would be familiar with when it comes to like nuclear disasters. Um,
right.
so what exactly can you kind of walk us through what exactly went wrong with both of those incidents to make them so like catastrophic? And like I'm sure they're
Yeah.
all really complicated, but like yeah.
Well, I can start with so on my channel
Mhm.
yestv.org, uh, you can find a video uh, with Reed Tanaka in it, and so from memory, essentially on 3/11/2011, the Tohoku earthquake went off. It was, I think a couple dozen miles from the closest nuclear power plant, Onagawa
Mhm.
nuclear plant. And so that earthquake shook. It was a 9.2 earthquake, one of the largest that part of the world has ever seen. In fact, the world has ever seen hardly any 9 point something earthquakes.
Yeah.
And so Onagawa detected that shaking, and it does what's called a scram. It forces these tubes into the water, and but these tubes actually absorb all the neutrons that were going to make the atom split. So those control rods and the poison rods went in immediately, and the temperature starts to drop.
Okay.
Then comes the tsunami. Giant. Uh, I think it was it 11 meters something. It was an
Yeah,
enormous tsunami,
absolutely.
and it crashes into the seawall at Onagawa, and Onagawa is fine. A couple hundred town residents of the town actually went inside the fortifications for that plant in order to seek shelter. Unfortunately, a couple hundred miles south at Fukushima Daiichi and Daini, it was a different situation. This enormous sea wave came in and it plowed into the substructure of that nuclear plant. So the reactor's a little bit above, just this ground level, so they can do maintenance on it, right? But then, so this water's rushing in, and it wipes away all of this support infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
All of these machines basically are there because the reactor plant, well, the plant was laid out by an American company who were worried about tornadoes.
Okay.
And so
Yeah,
all
the
of the critical, yeah, all of the
tornadoes
critical
very common in
infrastructure,
Japan.
right? It was in the wrong side of the building.
Yeah.
It should have been up off the first floor, off the ground floor, in order to avoid that tsunami. So all these backup generators got wiped out. A lot of infrastructure was critically damaged because of the tsunami, and the result is they had to bring out cables and batteries, and eventually they opened up valves and started putting seawater in the reactor, which really ruins, the reactor, but it kept them cool enough that they didn't melt down or explode.
Well, that's good.
Explode from the hydrogen buildup.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, even though Fukushima Daini the workers were able to save those reactors, there were 3 of them out of the 12. 3 of them melted down, released hydrogen from the fuel cladding. The hydrogen was built up and was not vented like in San Onofre or in 3 Mile Island. There was some venting that equalized the pressures and prevented hydrogen buildup. In Fukushima, it was all sealed up in a box, and eventually it went off.
And was it sealed up because the backup generators had gone off? Or is
it
just
was
construction?
It was sealed off because of the scram and some of the design of the recovery from the scram. And Reed's video goes into much more detail than I remember. And so he talks about how the circulation of air and water was to the pump building, but during the scram, that gets cut off, and so you've just got this sealed box full of hydrogen gas ready to go up. And the rest is history. Then we saw, a evacuation radius, and that radius was expanded.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw all sorts of measures that culminated in just constantly pumping water through that reactor site. And that's why we have 1 million tons of water outside of Fukushima Daiichi to this day.
Okay. So, and then, so that's Fukushima. And when it comes to Chernobyl, can you give us like a relatively quick overview?
Yeah. So I 90% endorse the Chernobyl HBO special. Essentially, they've got a reactor. It's got to come online fully in the next month, and so they need to test a loss of forced cooling. And I think it was something like, can the internal momentum of the turbine keep its own cooling pump online? And so that's what they're trying to test. So they shut all the external cooling down. They scrammed the reactor, or they took it very low in power, and tried to see if it would keep going. Now, there were delays and miscommunications among the staff, and it put this reactor into a state where it had a big suppression on the reactivity, and so they kept pulling out all the rods, and then they decided to put them in when it started powering back up. The problem is that act of putting them in very suddenly created the coefficient that essentially turned that reactor into a bomb. And it went what's called prompt critical.
Okay.
So, yeah. Or almost prompt critical. I think this is sort of a debate within the nuclear community, in fact. But it went off. It cracked the reactor open, and then water and air rushed in and flashed to steam, and that flashing to steam really ripped the building apart.
So, how do we prevent stuff like Fukushima and Chernobyl from happening again? Like, what have been the safety um,
Yeah.
precautions taken since then?
Well, we've of course learned about that positive void coefficient that Chernobyl had.
Hmm.
We've avoided that, corrected that design. In fact, I think there are about 8 or 9 RBMK Chernobyl type reactors left on the planet, and those have had their defects corrected. In fact, there was Chernobyl reactor number 3, or is it 4? One of them is right next. It's the twin of the reactor that exploded. It ran until the 90s.
Okay.
So that so in that case, it's a physical correction. In Fukushima, of course, they corrected where they put the backup generators, and places like Onagawa are eligible to come online these days. Other errors relate to understanding the equipment you're working with. Things like 3 Mile Island was 100% a personnel issue because they were trained to run submarine reactors with certain characteristics, and they had procedures for those characteristics, and they improvised based on the knowledge of those characteristics. Whereas working in a land-based reactor with a lot more air flowing around literally on the outside instead of the tubes being full of water being a deadly problem inside a submarine,
Hmm.
it's it's a simple procedure on dry land.
Right.
After Fukushima, similar to that training, after Fukushima, the U.S. put in place what's called the Beyond Design Basis response. So we have huge designs for these reactors and describing everything that could possibly happen to them.
Hmm.
So we think, and those are called design basis issues or design basis accidents if one of those should happen. And there's procedures and things that can be trained on for these. After Fukushima, we had the Beyond Design Basis response plan implemented. So there are many different procedural changes that just add another layer of readiness to nuclear plants in the U.S. since 2011.
Okay. Yeah, like what I seem to be getting from you is that like the reactors themselves are pretty solid. Like the
Right.
reactors themselves don't really have tons of problems. It's the infrastructure around them that is leading to disasters.
That is essentially where we're at with third generation reactors. There's little improvements here and there that keep happening that make it less and less likely for something like this to go wrong. We now have what's called advanced technology fuels or accident tolerant fuels that
Hmm.
have different melting points, that they actually have a copy of that poison rod inside of every fuel pellet. So if it does melt down, it'll become inert much more quickly. Um, all sorts of really wonderful technologies that are not a radical departure from what we're finishing building in the U.S. today in Vogel, Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay.
We're not outside Atlanta.
So can I ask you about like maybe some more like um they seem to be maybe more near future types of reactors
Yeah.
uh like thorium reactors. I've heard some buzz about those. I've heard some buzz about molten salt reactors, though
Yep.
I'm not entirely sure if molten salt reactors are actually nuclear energy or not. So, I'm just curious. I want to pick your brain on these things.
Yeah. So thorium is another kind of fuel. It just has slightly different characteristics, and it has pretty interesting chemistry when you put it in a molten salt reactor. So that's it. Thorium is hugely plentiful. It's about 3 times as plentiful as uranium. Uh, Even though we're not going to run out of uranium anytime soon, this would just be another way of extending our capability, our energy capabilities into the far future.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, and there's some awesome like tricks that you can do with the chemistry that make it attractive, especially for missions that or reactors that are very close to a a dense part of the planet, a population dense part of the planet, and so having a low pressure chemistry, unlike water that blows up when it turns to steam, the molten salt in the thorium reactor doesn't expand exponentially when the temperature changes.
Okay. Interesting. And
Yeah.
so, like, I guess, like, it seems like the main benefit of, like, thorium is it's more plentiful, more readily attainable by, like, different countries that might want to build reactors. And
Yeah.
what can you expand a little bit about on the what makes it safer?
Mhm.
Is it the salt reactor, like the salt based reactor, that makes it safer next to high density areas?
Right. It is essentially the it's called a molten salt, or a liquid fluoride molten salt reactor is one of the
Hmm.
more popular thorium ideas, and the chemistry behind that is that it just sort of trades around the radioactive particles in this fluoride salt soup, and what's really beneficial about that is that we can take anything that's going to be weaponizable and strip the elements out before it gets to that point is the hope. So you're left with no plutonium ever occurring in the core, or almost ever occurring in the core. Even in fact, the little bit of plutonium that exists is the stuff that we use in our space probes. It's not the weapons flavor. The 239 is the weapons flavor, and 240 is super rare spaceship fuel, basically.
Okay.
Um,
So it's just mildly spicy instead of, medium spicy or
it it's
extremely spicy.
yeah. All uranium is sort of medium spicy. It is that plutonium 239 that is has this really weird in between half life. So it's a really bad contaminant to humans. If you get plutonium 239 inside you, it goes straight to your bones basically. Doesn't doesn't go away until it decays, which it does in about 12,000 years.
It's a bit of a time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So and it'll mess you up. So don't eat plutonium ever, kids. Uh,
Too
the
spicy.
too spicy. Uranium, in fact, does pass. If it's uranium oxide, it'll go right through your body in a couple days. So, uh,
Okay.
not extremely bad, but don't taste it. Just no.
Forbidden soup.
uh, yeah. Don't eat the spicy rocks. And if you say that to someone on Twitter and they get it, you will have found nuclear Twitter.
Gotcha. Um, so can I ask you, like, when it comes to uranium, because I was just doing some cursory reading the other day. It seems like a lot of uranium production has been like really drastically cut since like the 80s.
Hmm.
Is that because of like a drop in demand for nuclear power or nuclear reactors, or is it because we have more efficient reactors and we just don't need more fuel manufactured? Like, what's the deal with that?
This is another comedy of errors that happened around the 70s and 80s in the U.S. After the baby boom, we sort of had these projections about where populations would be growing, and how fast we would need to implement like alternative energy ideas, because we were becoming a larger country. But the funny thing happened was is the birth rate did did go down after the baby boom, and so we didn't have the same kind of population explosion in the U.S. that we were considering might happen, and also there were huge economic cycles, economic downturns, which meant not as much demand, and so the uranium mining was the tail end of that, and it's just like instead of having to fuel 2,000 reactors we ended up having to fuel 400 reactors. Also, uh, we use a lot of that uranium, unfortunately, to make a huge plutonium nuclear stockpile. And so, after we slowed down building bombs, there was much less demand for that uranium. And also, we've gotten much better at how we mine uranium. I think Canada does this amazing thing, and I think Australia does as well. It's called in situ mining, where they basically flush chemicals between two tunnels in order to pull the uranium up. And it'll do that because it's a salt. So all you have to
Oh,
do is
interesting.
a little funny thing with the chemistry to get that salt extracted from this layer of ground between two tunnels.
Fascinating. Um, Interesting. So, okay. So basically it's just population stopped
Mm,
growing as fast as we thought it would, and we just kind of shut it down because there was less demand for bombs. And
yep.
okay, interesting. Um, Also, I was reading like when it came to like triso fuel reactors, I was reading that like we've had this technology for like 60 years, but we haven't really tried to refine it. What like it seems like there are a lot of benefits for having triso fuel. Is it
Mm-hmm.
mostly just because in the 60s it was more difficult to produce? Is that basically it?
Well, it is more difficult to produce. As well, it is very, very difficult to recycle. So what happens in a modern nuclear power plant in nuclear reactor is that 95% or more of that fuel is unconsumed. It's ready to go after you recycle it and charge up the 235 a little bit. So it's all uranium reactors are 235 and 238, and you basically it eats up all the 235 and makes a little bit spicier plutonium, and you want to recycle that so that we could use you know we could get 30 to 50 times as much energy out of that uranium fuel if we just recycled it. And so unless we have a inside the reactor idea for how to use up that the rest of the 95% of energy, no one wants to build trace fuel because it's like throwing away all this fuel when your reactor can't burn it anymore in conventional reaction.
Hmm.
And that's the no, I think if you talk to a nuclear engineer, that's the number one thing that I hear them complaining about is like, well, you can't reprocess it, you can't crack that armored shell open, it's too
Okay.
tough.
Yeah. Um, so from my understanding, we don't do a ton of like recycling of nuclear fuel in the United States.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, Jimmy Carter sort of had to face this political and social crisis of a lot of people on the left who were very anti-war wanted us to stop using all nuclear technology because nuclear technology is associated with the bomb. And then we also had these continued oil crises in the 70s. So Carter put together this compromise that was we'll continue using nuclear energy, but we will not allow civilian plants to do recycling of nuclear waste, meaning no recovering that 95% fuel because there's a small chance it could be used for other technologies like weapons. And so that was one of the reasons that Carter made this decision.
Hmm.
We will not reprocess fuel in the United States while they do like they do in France. They
Right.
reprocess all of their spent fuel.
So why hasn't that decision been revisited? Because right now, from my understanding, we take spent fuel and then we just put it in holes in the ground and don't do much with it. It seems like that's
Yeah,
counterproductive.
that's pretty much what happens. And fortunately, they're not deep in the ground yet. They are sitting in these giant concrete casks waiting to be reprocessed someday or put in a permanent storage place. It sort of either fortunately or unfortunately, we keep getting better at mining things. So there's this old tale that we only have a couple hundred years of uranium left. Well, now we have thousands to tens of thousands or billions of years of nuclear fuel left on this planet. Just because we're getting so good at mining, we're able to do things like pull uranium straight out of the seawater. Remember, it's a salt, so it's spread around the sea, and you can do some basic chemistry to pull it out. And so it's almost too expensive to reprocess spent fuel when they could just keep pulling uranium out from under the ground.
Okay, so it's more of like, I guess, the market forces behind the plutonium production?
Yeah, capitalism. There
Okay.
it is.
Okay.
It's so cheap to just keep mining when, even though we've got, like, look, 20 times as much fuel is just sitting there. Why don't you recycle that? Come on.
Well, yeah, and especially when you have it in already. Oh, yeah. I agree with you. But so this brings me to a point that I noticed during my research. It seems like there's a lot of privatization of nuclear projects. And I'm kind of wondering why that is, when it seems like it is an incredibly something that maybe shouldn't be privatized. I guess I like, it seems like maybe having like accountability for these projects and how they're done to like the people who are, you know, next to these reactors and stuff. You like, capitalism can sometimes cut corners when it comes to construction. It can sometimes, you know, do things that are less than ideal for the actual people receiving the services. So I'm kind of wondering how it came about that it seems mostly like startups and a lot of like government contractors doing these extensive building projects.
Well, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, it essentially, we had this plan to build all these public resources. You know, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was TVA, it was Bonneville Power Association. These were two huge publicly owned exchanges, energy markets, and they served these two regions, and they're these public utilities, and TVA and BPA both participated in this massive build out of nuclear energy. In TVA, there wasn't as much revenue, or at least not much changing in East Tennessee, and so it was also related to the government making the bombs in Oak Ridge, and these projects just went up just by supporting that farmland. Washington, on the other hand, we were expecting a large population boom. So us being a slightly conservative, we're like a weird moderate state. I mean, as blue as we turn in presidential elections, we have this long history of people being really stingy and really bad libs about the services that our state gives. So instead of just straight up funding transit like the East Coast did, we decided it had to be this tax. And instead of straight up funding clean energy, BPA tied in all of these utilities into a big partnership. And so it became this giant public-private partnership, and some of the cities pulled out, and that whole project just became a mess. We only got one reactor out of that build-out. And all across the nation, it was fossil fuels versus nuclear energy. So it was literally just an opportunity for fossil fuel companies to get an edge on one another, to get into this technology that looked like it could phase out all fossil fuels. So you bet they invested in it, but they didn't invest too hard, just enough to keep up with their competitors. So I think the fortunate thing is that we have this large international community that participates in nuclear safeguards called the IAEA, and
Hmm.
so where we have monitoring of private enterprise, the safety has standards. It has the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and then that NRC reports some of the details of all of our safety process to the IAEA, where we all of the nuclear power nations keep track of each other and make sure we don't make bombs with it.
Gotcha. Okay. So you are kind of an advocate for nuclear energy, largely
Mm-hmm.
because you think it is a pathway towards saving the world from climate disaster. So, like,
Yes.
do you foresee any problems when it comes to scaling up the production of nuclear power plants, for example? Or I know like one of the big hurdles right now is that the investment in creating them seems to be pretty big, or
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of red tape around them, from what I understand, and they can take anywhere from like minimum of like 5 years to make to decades. Um,
Right.
so like how do you kind of foresee this being done on like a massive scale that like we haven't seen before?
Well, it the idea of time and money and red tape is all interrelated, unfortunately. And it's not that we have too much regulation on nuclear energy. It's that what regulation exists has been manipulated and tampered with by uh, these little political games that Obama and the senator from Nevada were playing with one another, as well as just our national liberal stinginess that we wanted to save money in the 90s. The Republicans came back into power and took away all this nuclear research that was happening.
Okay.
So all of the build outs that were happening uh, in the late 80s eventually spun down because of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. And then all of the builds that were hanging on for life shut down even further, even harder, because of this liberal government reform. So that's the consequence in terms of when you do that to an industry, it's not going to make progress. And the longer, the longer build times are either directly attributed all to the US the US turning off support for nuclear, or the world taking a break and reassessing after Fukushima Daiichi.
Hmm.
Finance. When a project takes longer, we're using borrowed money from the capitalist system. The
Right.
price goes up.
Yeah.
In fact, the lending rate sometimes called the discount rate for nuclear power projects is upwards of 4, 5, 6, 7%, whereas it should be, if this was a bridge or a stadium even, the loan rate would be a municipal loan down to 1 or 2%. And right now, those overnight lending rates for the US is super low. And this is one of the things that we're going to use in the Green New Deal to just build back, Biden's thing, build back better. We're going to
Right.
rebuild America, and we just have all this money begging to be lent out right now to governments, and it is time to reinvest.
Um, okay. Yeah. 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 That all makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Do you foresee any problems when it comes to outside of the U.S., for example, like when it comes to building like nuclear in less developed nations? Like, is this something that's going to be a major problem, or when it comes to like supply lines, like for fuel, like all like the logistics of this? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So there's a couple really good examples. First, Russia is actually doing this great thing where they literally have a reactor factory. It's called atom mash, where they take all these pre-forged components and bend them and shape them into the final reactor product,
Oh, that's
and then
wild.
they ship it out. I mean, they're not as big as some of the American reactors, but this is the kind of reliable, repeatable manufacturing that translates very well to a reliable product. And then, of course, the Russia and Rosatom themselves are being like 50-50 owners with the local whoever needs the power. And a lot of like I think the reactors going up in or outside of Cairo are Russian reactors. So
Interesting.
there's sort of this nation that is usually good about about their reactors, and certainly in modern times. I mean, not just Chernobyl, but in modern times even Russia is usually good about monitoring. I of course would be overjoyed if we saw more American products out there, like my friends all around Seattle are working on, because we are, just that other geopolitical force that we want to make sure more countries in the world are more stable, and giving them energy does wonderful things. Another example would be UAE
Mm-hmm.
in the Middle East. The Emirates have signed a peace deal with Israel, and they're becoming very good friends with Israel. And they have signed, in fact, the best agreement that exists that says they will have nuclear energy, but they won't do any uranium refinement. That's the thing
Okay.
Iran gets in trouble with, is that they enrich their uranium too far, so that it's more attractive for weapons production.
Gotcha. Um, yeah, and that's another thing I wanted to ask you. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
when we proliferate this technology, what are there risks of countries using this for weapons grade manufacturing? Because I
Yeah.
think that it is really attractive for, less empowered nations to suddenly find themselves being a nuclear
Mm-hmm.
nation. There are a lot of advantages that come along with that, like diplomatically.
Right, and it's really interesting. I hadn't encountered the argument that everyone should have nuclear weapons until I really got involved in leftist Twitch, and there's basically uh, I don't even know if you would qualify anyone as a tanky for having this opinion, but it feels a little tankyish, but not really, because it's not the major nuclear nations. It's not Russia. It's not China. It would be every independent nation having their own seat at the geopolitical table. Now, on the other hand, that's conventionally bad, and I understand that we're not happy when we go to a party and everyone's got a gun in their pocket. we're,
True.
we're happy because we're all comfortable and having a good time, and no one's causing any problems. So I think my position remains: fewer nuclear weapons is a good thing, and so we have this fantastic international community called the IAEA.
Hmm.
We had some very difficult lessons that we learned in the past, like India constantly breaking their treaties. Like, they promised Canada they wouldn't misuse the technology they were given for energy, and they did, and we forgave them, and and then they broke the next promise, the next treaty about nuclear weapons. So a lot of hard lessons were learned there, and then Pakistan basically did a very similar thing: is that they spied on the European Nuclear Agency and copied documents that helped them develop their program. Those are the only two nations that have gotten nuclear weapons out of a civil nuclear program.
Really? Okay.
Every other nuclear armed nation came directly from collaboration or nuclear weapons program espionage.
Interesting. Okay. Um, what do you see as like some of the major advances? Like I've heard some buzz about like in the near future, like beyond just like thorium, but like when it comes to production, you mentioned like manufacturing reactors in factories.
Hmm.
I've heard some buzz about like 3D printed materials to construct
Oh
at
yeah.
least the facilities or the infrastructure around reactors.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, just thoughts on stuff like that.
I am really excited in like uranium extraction from the sea is a big one. The small modular reactors and micro reactors, these are, from dozens of megawatts up to like 80 or a couple hundred at most. These are actually so small that the usual steam explosion problems that we're worried about with conventional reactors just aren't possible because it's such a small size.
Hmm.
Uh, that's the next step. That's what's going to get done in the next 5 years. We're going to start to see at least one plant, I hope, come online with the micro or the small modular reactor design, and that'll be in Idaho Falls,
Okay.
right across the border from Utah. And after that, there's so many different technological options that are all going to be 10 to 20 years down the road.
Okay.
So in order to solve the long-term issues that most folks have with nuclear energy, we need those breeder reactors, we need the molten salt reactors, we need all of these technological options.
What are
But
breeder
that
reactors?
so the thorium reactor is a good example of a breeder,
Hmm.
because it takes something that's not fissile, something like thorium 232 can't split itself. So you translate or you transmute thorium 232
Hmm.
to uranium 233. And once that's been transmuted into uranium, then it's fissile, or this 233 at least is fissile. And so a breeder reactor does that. It would turn the 95% nuclear waste, unspent fuel, and turn it into something fissile. And so it's
Okay.
literally a solution to nuclear waste is put it in a breeder reactor and you're done essentially.
Awesome. So just to kind of expand on that, I'm sorry to kind of go off on this tangent
Oh
from
no,
where you were
yes.
talking before, but this is interesting. What happens when we do recycle this waste, and then
Hmm.
what ends up coming out the other side when it's like we can't recycle it anymore? Is it more dangerous when it's like that, or is it just like we're basically just back where we started, where we need to put it in a hole somewhere?
It does need to go into a hole eventually.
Okay.
So and let's consider first how big this is and how long it lasts.
Hmm.
Traditional nuclear waste will be 4 kilograms for my entire lifetime of energy use. It's a little smaller than this. It's about the size of a normal soda can,
Right.
and that would be 4 kilograms, really heavy. Uh, but the result is um, that my entire life of energy demand is satisfied for the same amount of weight that would be 11 days of my landfill use.
Right.
So that's like just the trash we throw away is so much worse in terms of volume uh, than the toxic parts of that fuel. And this is even that 95% wasted stuff. The worst parts of it are gone in 300 years. If if we change to a breeder reactor, it's a lot smaller.
Oh
It's
wow.
way smaller, like a chapstick or a golf ball sized. About I think it's about 600 grams, maybe a little less if I got the math right, and that would last my entire life.
You know,
And then
when you put
that,
it in these real world
mhm,
terms, it seems
yeah,
much less scary and attainable. I
yeah,
guess like, yeah.
yeah. And after 300 years, all of that is decayed to background.
Hmm. Is it more is I guess is it more radioactive when it's condensed down like that? Like or is
Oh
it
well, the
basically?
yeah, if it is pure cesium 137, strontium 90, the really bad fission products, that is going to be very very reactive. Of course, we can dilute that into cement or into some kind of caulk. Is like goes in the walls, in the joints of your walls.
Hmm.
This is the kind of substance that gums it up and makes it not mobile in water, and that's the formula for some of the best ways to dispose of nuclear waste is put it in this product, in this caulk product that just doesn't accept water.
Okay. Yeah. Can I ask why we don't generally do that now, or at least as far as I know?
Yeah, though you're absolutely right. In fact, you can look up Jim Conca. I'll type that name in chat.
Yeah.
You can find Jim Conca on Forbes. He's a geoscientist, a geologist, I should say, geologist. Not yeah, and he was part of the scientists working on Yucca Mountain and the site selection for Yucca Mountain. And basically, we had a bunch of individual political decisions that people just got in a committee and voted. Hey, we think that the all of the nuclear waste from our weapons development program at Hanford should be baked into a piece of glass, when the caulk system was just as good and much cheaper and quicker to do and doesn't take a huge amount of oil and gas to fire up the kilns.
Hmm.
And so Jim Conca writes extensively about these kind of problems in Forbes. Um,
Okay.
and yeah, I guess I should say the caulk substance is for the really hot waste like weapons waste or
Hmm.
that breeder fuel waste. We would want something to take that cesium 137 and make sure it is completely isolated. And so there's all sorts of options out there. And really,
Okay.
putting nuclear waste in the giant steel and concrete casks that we do today is not a bad option.
Okay. Um, yeah, and so yeah, I guess it seems like a lot of the issues around nuclear energy, at least as far as like I'm getting it so far, seem to be that people are kind of making a trade-off between, well, this is safe enough, or there are better options out there, but this is safe enough. We don't need to entomb it in this caulk solution or anything like that. Um,
Here, there's my
oh, interesting.
yeah. So those big concrete cylinders, they're about 3 times as tall as a person, and and it just sits there for hundreds of years without us needing to intervene.
Hmm.
Um, but you were asking about the different solutions.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just saying, like, it seems like a lot of the issues around nuclear energy tend to be, like, I guess, from like a bureaucratic standpoint, like we're making like whatever's slightly more cost
Mm.
effective. Like we don't want to actually absorb the full cost of like 100% safety or as close as we can get to that. Um,
I mean that's the track we're on right now,
mhm.
with technology that is not advancing at all. We have done the very best job that can be done with bureaucratic safety.
Yeah.
So it is, uh, you know, any configuration that we can think of that could fail, we're ready for, and even we have plans to even improvise for when we're past that design.
Hmm.
We don't do anything risky with the waste. We put it in these giant containers, and the next steps, the steps that lead to things like inherent safety and proliferation resistance and just less very small waste stream. Those are what are called fourth generation nuclear designs. There's literally a international committee on, okay, what kind of reactors could achieve these characteristics, and we came up with like 6 or 7 of them,
Hmm.
and those are the Gen 4 reactor designs. Uh,
And when are they expected to kind of come online?
Well, the
Seems
molten
like maybe
salt,
those are the ones
yeah,
we want to build around the world if we're going to do that.
yeah, if we can. So the molten salt reactor still 5 to 10 years off, but China has finished one high temperature gas guest for the excuse me high temperature gas reactor, uh, and they haven't released a lot of information about it. But the high temperature gas reactor was one of those fourth generation designs. So there's just this opportunity that's been done once. It's one of China's couple hundred reactors, and so it'll be interesting to see if they keep building on this and iterating on this great opportunity.
Interesting. Um, okay, so it seems like 5 to 10 years minimum for like the first of the next gen reactors to come online.
At least in the West,
Okay.
if China starts pumping these out, we might see them much sooner. But yeah, for the United States or European fourth gen reactors, it is going to take a while just to get there. Unfortunately, about as long as the fusion reactor, and is about as long as restarting our nuclear construction capability in the U.S. itself.
Hmm.
So I think we should try. We should be trying all of these things. We should build renewables as fast as we can. We should also have a fourth generation nuclear and a current generation nuclear project built up wherever we can.
Um, do you have like a resource guide? Revolt Rise in chat is asking like, do you have like some kind of like fact sheet or statistics that we can share with some people, like whenever nuclear power comes up again in the
Mm-hmm.
future on the show?
Yeah, I definitely recommend the website whatisnuclear.com. Your mod's been or Nightbot has been sharing that. It's
Okay.
the second to last link in the info. That's whatisnuclear.com.
Mm-hmm.
My my friend Nick makes that site, does a really great job at it. There's also some other wonderful advocacy organizations like Generation Atomic that has little memes and stuff they put out everywhere. So there's definitely a lot of infographics, but whatisnuclear.com literally comes from a reactor engineer, a reactor designer, and professional engineer.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Oh, and one other question I wanted to ask you.
Mhm.
I have been reading like weapons grade uranium, for example, is highly enriched, and it has a lot of like capabilities to fuel reactors.
Right.
But we don't use it to do that. Is there like a reason for that, other than like it could be misused for weapons? Is that basically the primary reason we don't?
Yeah, and that's part of our agreement with Iran is that um, Iran cannot enrich their uranium too high because it is possible to turn very high purity U-235 into a literal bomb itself, but also high purity U-235 is the best way to breed plutonium for weapons,
Okay.
unfortunately. So we have to be very careful of that. But on the other hand, a U.S. nuclear submarine runs its engines on highly or a larger fraction of uranium. I think it's 20 or 30, but I'm not an engineer,
Right.
so I get the numbers mixed up sometimes. Essentially, yeah, high enriched uranium for a nuclear submarine. It that reactor will go decades without refueling because it has so much U-235 in it.
Okay. I
Reactors in space or even our normal reactors are much lower, between 15 for space fission reactors and down to like 4 or 3% for all of the civilian reactors.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you on again to talk about like
Yeah,
nuclear versus other renewables and other forms of energy sometime.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, this has been a really informative discussion. Thank you so much for giving us your
cool.
time today.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to shout out before you go?
Yeah, you can check out, well, of course, yestv.org has a lot of long form lectures and other information that I've consumed and like to spread. I have a local group called Seattle Friends of Fission, which is the nuclear energy advocacy org. And for energy advocacy in general, my favorite national organization is Citizens Climate Lobby.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again for all of that. And everyone, please go check out Carl's channel over at your Environment Seattle. They're doing a lot of really great work over there, and I mean, everything I've seen from you is really based and cool. I think your politics seem to be pretty awesome, as well as your stance on energy. And thank you for just undertaking all of this effort on your own volition to like educate people about nuclear energy, kind of demystifying it a little bit.
Yep. You're welcome. Thanks for all the great questions.
Yeah. And you're welcome to come back anytime, okay?
Cool. I'll hang out and chat for a little bit and try to clean up a few other questions that I saw
Yeah.
pop up.
Okay. Yeah, thank you
Awesome.
very much.